I love watching the clicker tick.
Yeah.
This particular view of my, screen, I can't really see anything except for you guys. It's all good.
All right. So as folks continue to file into the virtual Zoom room, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Julia, a bookseller at Politics and Prose. We're live with Ethan Kross and Angela Duckworth discussing chatter, the voice in our head, why it matters, and how to harness it. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions during the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. And before we begin, we really want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We're so grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. And we'd also like to thank Character Lab, a nonprofit connecting researchers with educators to create greater knowledge about the conditions that lead to social, emotional, academic, and physical well-being. Let's get started. Tell a stranger that you talk to yourself, and you're likely to get written off as eccentric. But the truth is that we all have a voice in our head. When we talk to ourselves, we often hope to tap into our inner coach, but find our inner critic instead. In Chatter, acclaimed psychologist Ethan Kross explores the silent conversations we have with ourselves, interweaving groundbreaking behavioral and brain research from his own lab with real-world case studies, from a pitcher who forgets how to pitch to a Harvard undergrad negotiating her double life as a spy. Kross explains how these conversations shape our lives, work, and relationships. Kross will be in conversation with Angela Duckworth, founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She is also a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 2013 was named a MacArthur Fellow. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Ethan Kross and Angela Duckworth. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Julia. What a wonderful and warm introduction. And Ethan, I'm kind of feeling like warm is the right tone, because we are not only coupled here in an interview, but I can't even remember how long we've known each other. Would you mind reminding me and maybe telling the story of how we met? I think it's a good tee up for, the work that we both do.
So I think we didn't have the typical academic introduction. Angela was at Penn at the time, and I was at Columbia, and I think we're just a year apart. You're a year ahead of me. And Angela had tried to connect with my advisor at the time, Walter Mischel, who folks who are here might know as the Marshmallow Man. So the delay of gratification test, where you give kids a choice, one cookie now or two cookies later, two cookies if you wait, and the kids who wait end up becoming CEOs and win MacArthur awards and so forth. And Angela tried to land a meeting with Walter, and he said, well, why don't you go grab coffee with Ethan? And then we did, and we hit it off, and I think we've been friends and collaborators ever since. That's my memory, but is that
no?
accurate?
That is my memory, and I can't count how many years it's been, but I think over 10. And since I am such a super fan of your work and was there from almost the beginning, I want to ask you, kind of on a selfish personal note. My sister emailed me very recently and wanted to know about rumination. And since your book debuted today, I was only able to order it today, but I did, and I sent it to her. But I wonder, for my sister Annette, she said, what is it with like this pattern of thought that I can't get out of, and why do we even do it, and what do I do about it? Now I know that Chatter is very much about this, but I thought you could open with whatever you want to share on that broad topic.
Yeah, I mean, so Chatter really deals with this question of really introspection 101. So let me back up and tell you actually how I got into this interest in this topic. It actually has to do with where you are at Penn. So when I was growing up, my dad was a little bit unconventional, and from the time I was 3-4 years old, whenever something bad happened, he would tell me, go inside and try to figure out the problem, find a solution. So he would essentially tell me to introspect. And that was a skill that served me well throughout childhood and adolescence. Bad things happened. I'd turn the spotlight inward. I'd figure out why I messed up or why this happened. I'd get closure and move on. And then I went to Penn as an undergrad, and I don't think you were not there at the time.
Oh, I'm much older than you, by the way, Ethan. You know that. So yes, you went to Penn, and I was.
You don't look much older than me.
Thank you. But anyway.
In any case, I went to Penn and I took my first psychology class, and halfway through the semester, there was a class on introspection. And, I did the equivalent of roll up my sleeves and all right, I got this one. This is what I do. And then I came in, I was taught basically that in direct contrast to everything my dad had taught me, for many people, much of the time, when you're experiencing distress and you focus inward, you don't end up finding solutions. You end up ruminating and worrying and catastrophizing, which is what I call chatter. You get stuck in these negative cycles of thinking and feeling, which are really toxic. They interfere with our physical health, our relationships, our ability to think and perform. And so, so the big puzzle for me throughout my whole career has been trying to figure out, why is it that we have this capacity, which is an amazing gift, right? The ability to reflect on our lives. Like, that lets us problem solve, it lets us innovate and create, but we can't master it, right? And oftentimes we lose control of it when we need it most, when we're really struggling with a negative experience. And so that's really what the book is about. And it's very much to your sister's question about rumination. So if she has more questions, give her my number.
After she reads the book. After she reads the book. It should be there very soon. Shipping is fast. What is co-rumination?
So co-rumination is when you and I start talking about a problem and we start ruminating about it together. And so the issue of co-rumination raises a really, I think, interesting topic. When we're experiencing strong emotions, we often feel highly motivated to talk to someone else about them, right? We want to go to someone else to help us feel better about the experience. But what we've learned, what the science tells us, is when we talk to someone else, there are two things that you want to have happen ideally. One thing is you want to share what you're feeling. So I need to tell you about the last time I was rejected by someone. It happened earlier today, by the way. Someone didn't like an article.
I was going to say, wait, what?
Yeah,
I mean, not romantically.
No.
This has nothing to do with your wife, Laura.
My heart gets broken on a daily basis by my daughters, but that's a different kind of rejection. That's called parenting in life. So when I want to talk to someone else about something that I'm experiencing chatter about, I have to find someone who's willing to hear me out. And it's if I know that I could turn to you, Angela, and you're there to listen to me, share something about what I'm feeling, that can feel really good. Like, I feel connected to you, and that's a nice feeling. But if all I do is talk to you about what happened and what I'm feeling, and you egg me on, but really, the editor said what to you? I can't believe it. Oh my, how did you feel? What that does is you're essentially adding fuel to the fire. So you're just getting me to vent more, which doesn't actually give me a solution to work through my problem. So in an ideal world, the people we turn to for help do two things. They let us talk a little bit about what's bothering us, but then they help broaden our perspective. So they do things like, if you were coming to me with a problem, I might say, well, but come on, you get rejected quite a bit, right? And this has happened before.
And everybody gets rejected.
How'd you get over it last time? Or let me tell you what I do when I get rejected. I take 15 minutes to curse the bleep, bleep, bleep out of the rejector, and then I'm fine. I move on. So what I'm doing there is I'm trying to broaden your perspective, to put your experience in context. When we experience chatter, we get so fixated on the problem. We get stuck in a kind of tunnel vision where we can't think about alternative ways of making sense of the issue. And that can be really problematic. And so co-rumination is not a good thing.
So in practice, it seems like doing both of, and we're all going to be in this position again and again and again, right? Either as the person who's coming for the help and the, support, and probably the one who's initiating the venting, and then the person who's on the receiving end. And I wanted to ask you, practically speaking, it feels to me like not the most straightforward thing to figure out how to do, for example, that first step and figure out how long to do it. Really listening, making sure that like Ethan feels heard and seen, and lending that sympathetic ear, and then shifting into the zoom out. I struggle with that too, but it does feel to me like you can't skip that first step, right?
Absolutely not.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to skip that first step, because then you feel like you're being patronized, right?
Right.
It's really important that we establish these emotional connections with other people, that we know they care about us. That's the first preliminary step. And then once we do that, then we want to layer in that perspective broadening advice. But there's an art to this, right? Like, I wish, so there's a chapter in Chatter where I talk about this. I call it the power and peril of other people. And the idea is that the people we talk to can, even the most well-intentioned partners and friends, can sometimes make us feel worse, or they can make us feel really better. And so if you understand the dynamics that explain how to navigate the conversations that we have with others, hopefully we can move towards a better place. But there's an art to this, right? Different people need a little bit more validation at the beginning than others. So with Angela, with you, maybe you need to be heard for a couple of minutes and then we can shift, but other people may take more time. And that's part of being, I think, a good chatter advisor, if you will, being sensitive to the cues that are in the relationship.
So I want to ask you developmentally, because we both have kids. Mine are older, and I know we both care about kids. So developmentally, what does the trajectory look like for this ability to take a step back, to zoom out, to use the technical term, to gain some psychological distance from the situation, and by that, be able to regulate our emotions and make more rational decisions. So can you tell me something about childhood and adolescence?
Yeah, sure.
Like?
So there are different ways that we can distance from. So I don't think we've actually talked about distance. So maybe we should step back and talk about what distance is.
Yeah.
So
you do it.
I'll explain. So when we're experiencing chatter, we're zoomed in really narrowly on the experience. And what we've learned over the years is that one natural antidote to that state of chatter is to zoom people out, to broaden their perspective, to help people gain what we call, in technical terms, psychological distance from that experience. They could see it more objectively. And there are lots of different tools that people can use. So maybe we'll talk about some work on language, because that's always fun. And I think it has immediate value for people.
Yeah.
So one tool that we find really useful for helping people with chatter is something that we call distanced self-talk. And it involves trying to work through or coach yourself through a problem using your own name and other non-first person pronouns, words like you or he or she. And the idea is that you're essentially giving yourself advice like you're talking to someone else. Part of the reason why we think this is so useful is because we know from lots and lots of research, and I think this is probably true. If I could see all of you who were here, I would ask for a show of hands, but I think many of us have the experience of it being much easier to advise other people on their problems than to follow our own advice ourselves, right? This is there's a name for this. It's called Solomon's paradox. It's named after the Bible's King Solomon, who, here's a little factoid, was well known for being one of the wisest leaders in the history of leaders, but was giving advice. But when it came to his own life, he was awful. He had romantic triangles and concubines, and they fought, and it ultimately led to his kingdom's demise. So this is a basic feature of what it means to be human. it's easier for us to be objective when thinking about other people's problems than it is ourselves. And what we've learned is that language provides us with a tool to relatively effortlessly think about ourselves like we were another person. And using your name can help you do that. And so we've actually done some work on this with kids. We've taken this idea, this technique, which we've shown to be effective in adults for reducing chatter, and we've modified it for kids. This is called the Batman effect. And so when kids are working on really emotionally challenging situations that can cause chatter, we tell them to imagine that they're a superhero. So pick your favorite superhero, Batman, Dora the Explorer. And when they're working on a difficult, emotionally trying task, we tell themselves to try to coach themselves through that task like they were Batman in one experience, case. So if I'm the kid, like, all right, what's Batman going to do right now? And so what that does is it gives them some mental space from the experience. They're pretending to be someone else. And they're also pretending to be a character who's really good at managing adversity. And so that, we think, is also another important ingredient. And so, you asked me about my kids and developmentally, I've got a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I'll use this technique with my 6-year-old quite a bit. I'll ask her to, imagine your Dora. What would Dora do right now? When she's, tearing out of the tragedies that she experiences when, her older sister gets a chocolate that's a gram heavier than the one she gets. So, it's useful. So that's one example of a distancing tool that can be used with kids and adults that can be helpful for managing chatter.
Now, this might be like a black belt question, but who better to ask than you? I've been wondering about gender differences in rumination. So as we both know, rates of depression can be quite a bit higher for adolescent girls than adolescent boys. And that gender difference is maintained throughout much of development. Many scientists would attribute that gender difference to rumination, that girls and women tend to, I guess, have more chatter, if you want to use that terminology, or ruminate more. I don't know that science has an answer for why that is, but I wondered what your opinion was on that, or maybe you do have evidence on gender differences in chatter.
Well, let's give some vocabulary actually. So rumination. Rumination you could think of as chatter about the past. It's you're spinning about things that happened. Worry is chatter about the future. You're spinning about things that may have. What if? Both are pretty toxic, right? And both involve this negative cycle of thinking and feeling. And back to gender differences are relevant to both of those different kinds of chatter, with women and girls showing higher levels. I don't know of any good explanation for the origin of those gender differences. But what's interesting is that the tools that exist, the science-based tools that have been unearthed, so to speak, for managing chatter, those tend to not be linked with gender differences. So in other words, regardless of whether you're a male, female, trans, the tools work equally well for all of those different categories.
I know that we have used the word tool a lot ourselves when we talk about, psychological development. If you think about things as not that you're born with them but that you actually have to acquire the skill of, for example, managing either future or, past oriented chatter. And one of the projects that we work on together is the toolbox project. So I wondered if you could tell the story of, how it is that we came to work on that project, what it is, and why you're so invested in it.
Sure. So I've been teaching a class at the University of Michigan to undergrads, mostly seniors, as a seminar on the science of self-control. I've taught this class 4 or 5 times, and several years ago, the last time I taught it, I got a question from a student that really stumped me. The way the class works is every week students read, and I usually pepper them in a compassionate and fun way with questions that we discuss. And the final assignment is for the students to come to the class with questions for me, right? Like, they've learned everything. What's left on your mind? And as you probably know, I'm guessing, and like if you teach a class a few times, you can generally come to
like,
know
I got this. I know all the questions that are going to be asked.
yeah, it's a good question, really good. Here's the answer. Like the same questions tend to come up. But the last time I taught this class, I got a question that I hadn't ever gotten before. A girl named Ariel raised her hand, and she looked really angry at me, in fact. And she said, "Why are we learning about this now?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And then she went on to, she had a Shakespearean soliloquy where, like you see in the movies, and she stands up and, we've been learning about these different tools and techniques throughout the semester to help us think better, perform better, feel better. And why didn't anyone teach us about this stuff earlier when it could have made a difference? Like, why didn't someone teach us about this in middle school or high school? We're seniors now, we're graduating. And so the first thing I did was I did a delay tactic. I said, fear not, life is not over. You'll have opportunities to regulate your emotions after you leave college. But then I did something a little bit more cowardly, actually. I basically deflected, and I said, that's a great question. What does everyone else think about that?
I'm going to use that. That's a good one, Ethan.
It's a classic. It works well. But it didn't lead me to feel very good, because I started experiencing chatter about this. Why aren't we teaching kids, adolescents, about what we know about the science of managing our minds? Like, when you think about what we learn about things in middle school, high school, that someone deems is important. For example, I remember spending a lot of time learning about the digestive system in high school and peristalsis. And I know the digestive system inside and out. But if you ask me, how often does that information come in handy? Like, never.
Not often.
Right? Not often, maybe like once when my kids ask me why they can swallow food when they're hanging by their legs from the stairs, but that's it. It's not that practical. And then I think about the human mind and our need to understand how the human mind works, and specifically emotions, and how we can control our emotions and our chatter. And it seems to me that understanding how that works is critically important for our ability to navigate life successfully. And so two things came out of that classroom experience. The first is a project that you're involved in, where for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been working with teachers to take what we know about the science of self-control and chatter control and translate that science into engaging lessons for kids. And what we want to do in this project is see, what are the implications of teaching kids about how to control themselves? Does having that knowledge actually translate into them exercising more chatter control in their daily lives? And if so, does that make them happier and more productive and healthier? And then the second effort was the book that we're here talking about.
This book
right here.
It's in.
By the way, this cover took a long time to choose.
Love this
I'll just
cover.
say
I love this
there
cover.
there was a lot of chatter around the cover. In any case, this book was the other attempt, right? Not just to translate what we know about this topic for kids, but translate it for people more generally. And so my hope is that the book helps do that.
When I think about this like overall project, which is like really to make everyone more psychologically wise, to make everyone more psychologically sophisticated, to really take huge strides forward. When I think about my parents' generation and how little insight they had into emotion regulation, and then their generation, I wonder if you could go back in time, what you would have said to my dad. So I'll tell you, sort of like, we're in a parking lot. This is years ago. I'm probably in the back seat of the car. My dad's driving. It's Cherry Hill Mall, for anybody who knows New Jersey. And there's a speed bump in the parking lot, as there are. And we go over over the speed bump. I guess he hadn't seen it. So there's a little bit of a jar, right? But nothing bad. My dad literally said, as he was wont to say, very often his like chatter became audible, disaster. I mean, it just like came out of his mouth, like, without reflection. And, like I said, he would say this quite often.
He's doing self-talk right there.
Yes, he was doing self-talk. Like drop a drop a fork on the floor, disaster. Get a, A-, disaster. So, my dad didn't have the opportunity to read a book like Chatter, to, come to understand, the way his own emotions worked, etc. But should you encounter someone like my dad, where it's like very clear that they have this like catastrophizing, style, what would be some, advice that you would give that person?
Well, where do we start with that that situation? So, I think actually one of the things one important message is I think a basic one when you're working in this space, but it's not a lesson that people are necessarily taught in schools. And so it's something that I might take for granted and you might take for granted, but others don't know, which is that we are not victims of how we think, that our thoughts don't necessarily control us, that we possess the capacity to control our thoughts. And that if we can modify how we think, that can modify how we feel. That's a very, I think, simple, elegant idea that has enormous power. It's certainly the basis of lots of different forms of
therapies. Yeah.
But, I take it back to my kids, when we are overcome with chatter, it's so all consuming. It often, I think, doesn't feel like we have possibilities of reacting differently. And yet consistently, we find that we do. Now, it's not always straightforward how you do it, right? So to go back to the example of distant self-talk, some people stumble on that technique. I talk about in the book how Jennifer Lawrence, when she was getting flustered in an interview with the New York Times reporter, stopped and said, "Okay, get yourself together, Jennifer, you can do this." And, there are examples like that are very common, people stumbling on these different
LeBron James.
That's LeBron James.
Come on. My husband's favorite example.
Yeah. One of my favorite ones too. Malala Yousafzai. I mean, there are loads of examples in the book of different tools. Like we've talked about one. I talk about 20 different kinds of tools. Like, why does Rafael Nadal, one of the greatest tennis players in the world, who says that the hardest thing he struggles with is not his opponent, but the voices in his head when he's on the tennis court? Why does he pick his butt 3 times and twirl his hair and then arrange his, sweatband the same exact way before every serve? Why does he engage in those rituals? Well, turns out he does it for chatter relief. And there's a whole science which shows why that works. So we sometimes stumble on these things, but I don't think they're necessarily intuitive. And so I think step one is understanding that your thoughts are not your destiny. You have agency and the ability to manage how you feel. And then once you have that understanding, the next question is, okay, well, how do I do it? What are the tools that exist? What I try to do in the book is talk about the science behind what those different tools are, how they work, and how people can use them.
Here's my last question before we turn it over to the audience for their Q&A, which will be moderated. One of my favorite things about Chatter is that you take some things that seem obviously true and you show that they're not. And I think for me, the biggest and most, personally relevant example is venting, right? So intuitively, it feels like venting is great, right? And it feels like it should be a terrific skill or tool for emotion regulation. Can you say more about venting? And let me also thank you on behalf of all the parents who get the Character Lab newsletter. I know you wrote about this week. So tell me about venting, Ethan.
Yeah, so venting is very much related to the co-rumination idea, and the idea is, number one, there's a very strong belief in popular culture that venting is a good thing. that when we're upset,
Catharsis.
Freud talked about it, Aristotle, you see it on the self-help aisles when we used to have those in bookstores. I'm guessing Politics and Prose still does, but we wouldn't know because we're here. So there's this message that venting is useful, but people have been studying the consequences of venting for decades. And consistently, what they find is that when you vent, you feel more close and connected to the person you talk to, but your problems remain active. And the reason for that is you haven't done anything to change the way you think about that problem, right? All you're doing is describing how you felt. So that's creating a connection, but it's not taking that second step of modifying the way you feel. And that's where that perspective broadening tool becomes so important. And that's why I encourage people in the book to be really deliberate about who they choose to speak to when they experience chatter. So I'm exceptionally deliberate when I'm experiencing chatter. And yes, I experience it as someone who studies this stuff.
And as a human.
And as a human, exactly.
Yeah.
There are people in my life who I love deeply and I know love me back. And I don't talk to them about my chatter. I talk to them about other things because I know that if I talk to them, I'm just going to keep ruminating about it and worrying. And I don't want to do that. So instead, I've got like a whole board of advisors, right? And I've got some that are really that specialize in work-related chatter, and then others that specialize in relationship issues. And I go to them selectively to help. And so that's the deal with venting. The data don't support that it actually helps you work through your experience, but it does lead you to feel closer to the people you talk to.
Well, we not only need books for stories, we do need books for science. And thank you for writing Chatter and for dispelling really problematic myths like venting and giving us really an array of tools to live our lives better. So with that, I'm going to ask Ariana to join us and to moderate the chat.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thanks, Angela. All right, so we have some folks chiming in and maybe building off this point about venting and who we go to for social support. Ethan, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the context that we're in the pandemic and what advice you would give our audience about if they happen to be quarantining with family members who are really good at co-ruminating, but maybe aren't so good at helping them reframe or think broader. Is it possible to have a conversation with the people you're quarantining with and try to give them the tools to help them help you?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually did a study, and Ariana is involved in this study where we surveyed people for over time. We did a longitudinal study on COVID and how people are managing it. And one of the best predictors, the strongest predictors of feeling worse was venting. So consistent with this, what I'm telling you, we see it play out like in the data. So, I've just talked about what you're hoping to get out of another person in a conversation you have with them when you're dealing with chatter. But those same principles can be used to help you be a better chatter advisor to others, right? So if you're in a conversation with someone else and someone wants to talk to you about these experiences, one piece of advice I would give is hear the person out, let them talk, let them be heard, but also try to nudge them to broaden their perspective in some of the ways that we've talked about. And again, there's an art to this. Some people need a little bit longer to get it out than others, right? And so you want to be delicate with respect to how you have those conversations. But the principles I talk about are relevant not only to those of us who are seeking chatter support, but also to those of us who are in a position to provide it.
Maybe we have a question from somebody in the audience about this concept of chatter and an inner monologue. And there's some skepticism as to whether everybody really experiences this. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the phenomenon and the different forms that chatter could take. Does it always sound like talking to yourself or?
Yeah. Yeah. There was a stir on the internet about a year ago, I think, where someone said they don't have an inner monologue, and people went wild. How is that possible? And so let me try to break it down. And I talk about this in Chatter. It's hard to refer to the book as chatter when we're talking about the phenomenon of chatter. It gets very confusing.
Very meta.
Yeah. So first of all, like in terms of how can we think, right? We think in terms of words or images, and we have both of those capacities. And chatter really deals with the verbal side of life, the inner verbal side of life. And when we think about the inner voice, which I spend a lot of time talking about, you could think of the inner voice as a type of Swiss Army knife of the mind. It helps us do a lot of different things. Everything from keep a nugget of information active in our heads. And so, Ariane, if I gave you my phone number and I asked you to verbally repeat that number in your head to memorize it, you'd be able to do that very easily. And I would venture to guess that everyone in this Zoom session would be able to do that.
Two-factor authentication, baby.
Well, there you go, right? And I'll I'm usually pretty hesitant to make universal statements, but the reason I'm willing to venture this guess is because one of the things we know is that language and our ability to silently engage language is a basic feature of a well-functioning human mind, right? So we all have that capacity. It's called verbal working memory, if you want to know the technical term. So your inner voice helps you do that at one end, but then it also helps you do lots of other things like simulate and plan and rehearse. So if I know I'm talking to Angela today, 2 hours ago, I'm thinking in my head, all right, what is Angela going to say? I hear her say a question, and then I in my head rehearse what I'm going to say back, right? Where I'm planning, right? Your inner voice helps you do that. Your inner voice helps you control yourself, right? When we work on difficult puzzles, we often walk ourselves through the steps. Put this piece here, then do this silently. So that's your inner voice too. Now at the extreme, we often are engaging in that running commentary about what we're experiencing. Oh my God, what's going to happen? Will this happen? And that's another function. And different people use the inner voice to different degrees for all of those different functions. So whereas I'd argue everyone verbally rehearses things at times, there's a lot more variability when it comes to the kind of experience you see depicted in the movies of the person who's walking through Starbucks and there's the equivalent of a little person in their head commenting on every single thing. I think that kind of experience has a lot more diversity around it.
And perhaps that's a good entry point for a question from Christina about whether written approaches to addressing chatter might work differently compared to thinking.
As an intervention, you mean?
Perhaps, yeah. She's asking about journaling and specifically.
Yeah, so journaling is a great tool for helping manage chatter. And before I say a little bit more about journaling, one thing we didn't say I didn't say is a very important message, which are there are no single magic pills. And anyone who tells you that there are, I would be extremely skeptical of. There are lots of different tools that exist, and different tools work for different people in different situations. And a lot of tools work in conjunction with each other. So when I'm experiencing chatter, I'll often use several different tools to help me break me out of that state. So back though to one of those tools, which is journaling, one of the things we know is that telling people to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about a chatter-provoking experience for 1 to 3 days can be really, really useful. 15 minutes of writing for helping them create a story that explains that experience. It goes back to what Angela and I were talking about. Venting isn't enough because we're not shifting from that very hot emotional way of thinking to creating a story that has a beginning and an end and gives us closure. And expressive writing, journaling, helps us do it. And interestingly, part of the way that it helps us do it is by promoting distance, by giving us that sense of objectivity, because when we're writing about our feelings, we're the target, we become a character in our story that we're writing about, right? We're not just experiencing it, we're writing about that person and we're weaving that narrative around it. So, so that can be a very effective tool.
So Ethan, you've told us about distance self-talk and expressive writing or journaling, and a little bit about rituals and Rafael Nadal. We have some questions about other ways that people can learn to manage their negative emotions or other tools. If you had to choose just one or two more to share with us now, what would they be?
Sure. You know, I did a Q&A earlier today, and someone asked me to choose my favorite tool, and I said to them it would be like choosing one of my children. I can't actually do that, but I will give you a few. So in terms of how to think about these tools, like, you know, I think there are 20 something that I talk about in the book. I organize them. I think you can think about them as falling into 3 different buckets or categories. There are things you could do on your own to change the way you're thinking about your chatter to make yourself feel better. And we talked a little bit about distance self-talk as one example of those, that kind of tool. Then there are tools that involve other people. And we talked a little bit about how finding people to talk to who are skilled at not only hearing about your problem, but also broadening your perspective. That's a people tool. Another people tool is affectionate touch, which, you know, nowadays in the Me Too world becomes very tricky. And actually I had to navigate this space carefully in the book, but there's a lot of great data showing how an affectionate embrace, you know, a pat on the back, or I guess it's my shoulder, this shirt's a little, can't really go in the back. That can be really powerful, right? And through a variety of different pathways that I talk about in the book. And so there are other people tools that exist. And then the last category is one that I actually had the most fun researching for the book. These are what I call environmental tools, ways of navigating your physical spaces that can help us manage chatter from the outside in. One example of that is creating order in our environment. And so, like, I'll give you an anecdote. When I was writing chatter, there'd be moments that were ironically chatter provoking, like, oh my God, the deadline's approaching and I can't get this paragraph out, or it's not sounding right, or do I have the references right? And when that happened, I found myself doing something very odd for me, which is I would go to the kitchen and I would do the dishes and clean the dishes. And then when I was done, I'd carefully scrub it, wipe them down, and I put them away. And then I'd wipe down the counter. And I say this is very odd because I'm not the most organized, neat and tidy guy. Normally my office has piles of books and papers all over, and I'm totally fine, to my wife's dismay, with leaving the pots after dinner in the sink until the next morning. That's usually, by the way, when I tell that story, when the entire audience cringes. But maybe just you, Angela.
I can cringe on behalf of them.
Yes. So what was I doing, right? So something was beckoning me to organize. And when we're experiencing chatter, we often feel like we don't have control over what's happening in our mind, right? The thoughts are controlling us. And what we've learned, what the science tells us, is we can compensate for that lack of interior control by organizing the spaces around us, right? And so that's one way of harnessing your physical spaces and your environment to help you manage chatter. And there are other environmental tools too, like seeking out awe-inspiring experiences that promote a sense of awe. That can help with chatter, as can enhancing your exposure to green spaces. So the book covers a lot of really different territory that is not linked in the literature. So if you go to you'll have one group of scientists studying order and creating order and another group studying distancing. What I've tried to do is really put all of those different strands of research together to show how we have evolved in a way that tools exist all around us, inside us, in our relationships, and in the world, that all converge to have the same function, which is to help us manage these interior monologues run awry.
So one question we have here from Eric Nook is kind of the flip side of everything you just laid out. And he's asking, why is it that people continue to repeat their chatter and co-rumination when they aren't helpful? And if these strategies don't solve our problems, why aren't people essentially learning and
Yeah.
stop? Why do they keep doing them?
Well, Eric, thank you for coming. I wish I could say it's nice to see you, but nice to hear your question, and it's a good one. What we have happening when it comes to chatter is an adaptive response that ends up becoming maladaptive. The intuition to zoom in and focus narrowly on a problem to work through it makes a great deal of sense, right? So we have to focus on the issue at hand to work through it. And so the problem is that we end up then getting stuck when we try to do something helpful. And so I think you do actually have some people who do learn from this experience and don't continue ruminating about it. Instead, they do something else that's equally problematic, which is they try to avoid focusing on the problem altogether, right? That's not a good thing either. So you don't want to avoid the problem. You also don't want to get stuck in it. What you want to find is the middle ground, which is the ability to focus on the problem objectively without getting caught in the rumination. And that's what the book talks about doing.
So perhaps part of it is that people don't, as Angela was saying before, really, they don't know these tools yet. They weren't taught them. And hopefully the book can.
Well, I mean, and I think there's also, I think there are certain findings that are well established in psychology that aren't necessarily intuitive to people, right? And I think that's where we have the opportunity to educate, because take something like avoidance. Why would it be bad to avoid thinking about something that's bothering you? Like, that makes total sense, except we know from decades of research that chronically avoiding recurring problems doesn't make things better. It actually makes them worse. So I think there are a lot of cases like that exist where, venting is another example, Angela, right? Like, there's a strong intuition that venting is good, when in fact, there's mountains of data that suggest it's not. And so, our intuitions are often really good, but they're not perfect. And I think we can help with that.
We have a question from somebody along this line of venting. If somebody really just wants to vent, is there a way to give them space to do that in a way that won't be harmful?
Yeah, so this is a tricky issue, right? And one of the things I think you need to take into account is time, because time factors into this in important ways. So in the immediate aftermath of a negative experience or a chatter-provoking event, the temptation is to just vent, and a person's receptivity to having their perspective broadened is lower. So as time goes on, people become more receptive to the perspective broadening advice. And so that's one thing I think you can be mindful of when you're trying to give support. The other thing is, if a person says, like, I just want to vent, I think you can honor that request. But if you find that they're just getting more and more worked up, you can gently point out, like, well, what if we think about it this way? I mean, you can throw the softballs to try to start broadening their perspective to see if they might be receptive to it.
This is circling back to avoidance a little bit, but we have a question from Neil about people's habit of pretending that something bad isn't happening or is no longer true. And he offered an interesting kind of example, like repeatedly touching a sore tooth with your tongue to check if it's miraculously healed. Wondering if you have any thoughts on that phenomenon.
So tell me, guy, I'm stuck with the imagery of checking the tooth, and I'm actually thinking of my daughter, who is constantly wiggling her tooth to see if it's fallen out yet. But so tell me, restate the first part of the question, if you could.
He's wondering if you can comment on habit or tendency that people have to avoid problems or to pretend it's not happening or not true. And I think thinking about checking, you know that your tooth is sore, but you just keep revisiting it, thinking that maybe miraculously it's healed.
Well, let me take both. Let me take them separately because I view them as a little bit different. The avoidance part. So if it's a stressor that you don't have to face again, right? It's okay to avoid it. And there's data showing that if there's a one-time issue that is not going to recur, strategically avoiding it can actually do some good. George Bonanno has some great research on this. If it's a recurring problem, then all the things I talked about earlier apply. You want to be able to find a way to work through it. The tooth issue, continually checking it, I guess where I get stuck is, to me, that doesn't seem like avoidance. That seems more like maybe what we might call a safety seeking mechanism, where you're constantly trying to see if you're okay, which can also be problematic because for a whole other set of reasons. So I guess I don't see exactly the connection, but if we were together, Neil, we'd be able to talk a little bit more. Unfortunately, we're not, but we can, of course, continue after this in an email.
And Ethan would put his hand on your shoulder.
Well, I'd have to be very careful about that.
You might give him an elbow pump. I think you get that.
Fist is COVID makes it even more challenging for touch.
So let's see, I'm just looking through our chat here.
Ariana, while you look for the next question, I wanted to ask you about your dishwashing. Ethan, when you are stressed and you find yourself suddenly becoming the guy who wants to do the dishes after dinner, do you think it's a way of distracting yourself from unhelpful chatter, or is it that you're creating order in the physical space, which, you were talking about both of these things during the conversation. I wondered what dishwashing does for you specifically.
Well, there might be, so just to break it down, there are studies which have looked at that separately and show that simply creating order can be useful. Now, when you talk about a ritual that is engaged in organically, people think that rituals work through a few different pathways. I like to think about them, I talk about them as a kind of chatter fighting cocktail with lots of different ingredients. One thing rituals do is they help you create order because you're organizing things carefully. They also serve a distracting function often, right? Because they're often many steps that you have to perfectly complete in a particular sequence. That doesn't really speak to my dishwashing experience, because I am often still thinking about the issue in the back of my head in the same way that I might if I was going for a jog or a bike ride, right? So I'm not tightly focusing on the issue, but it's still active in a way that research suggests can be useful for having insights. The other way a ritual can be useful is they often have meaning. Now, washing the dishes doesn't have meaning, but Sunday morning ritual with my daughters where I make waffles and we go to the farmer's market and do other kinds of things, that has a deep kind of meaning that transcends my own concerns, right? And that transcendence, research shows, can be quite useful for reining in harmful chatter.
So we have about 6 minutes left. A couple of people are interested in the toolbox project that you talked about, whether it's available yet, and maybe more broadly, how they can talk to children about some of these tools that are in Chatter. Are they appropriate for kids?
So some of the tools in Chatter are appropriate for kids. And, the book itself, it tells the story of the science and I try to give a lot of anecdotes and stories to show how these tools play out in life. But at the end of the book, there's an appendix that just lists the tools that I talked about. And you could certainly review the different tools and see if you think they're appropriate. And I indicated in the book which tools have some data behind them for kids, specifically like the Batman effect. with respect to the toolbox project, so where we are with that is we have we have a curriculum that teaches high school, and it's relevant to middle school too, about the science of self-control and the different techniques that exist. So we have those lessons. We've also done a series of pilot studies in which we've shown that kids who go through this curriculum, they learn the information. So the curriculum does its job in terms of teaching the kids about the mind. And those are small experiments. What we were hoping to do this past fall, but something called COVID got in the way, was a large clinical trial where we worked with thousands of kids to put them through this curriculum and then track them over time to see what implications learning this information had for them. We obviously didn't do that. And so the plan is to do that next fall. And then once the study's done, the plan is to release these lesson plans for anyone who wants them. So lots of exciting stuff on the horizon that we just need to wait on.
So maybe as a final question, a couple of folks are wondering about the opposite problem of venting, what to do if all of your chatter really is internal. And so I'll ask that first, and then maybe you can also close us out with some advice about how people can figure out what tools work for them and what they need, how to best manage their chatter.
Right. So first question, so chatter, to be clear, is happening inside your head now. And so I think it very much is a personal struggle that we contend with. And other people can be helpful for managing that internal struggle. One of the things we know is that when people experience strong negative emotions that often characterize chatter, with a few exceptions, we're highly motivated to talk to other people to get help, but it's to get help with the stuff happening inside our head. So the book is very much about that internal struggle and how we can manage it in different ways. In terms of trying to figure out what tools work for different people in different situations. So this is a big challenge. I think it's a challenge that we face as scientists to do that kind of work, to figure out what those more complicated interactions are or combinations of tools. And I think it's a challenge for readers too. And my advice is to try the tool and see how you feel when you do it. Is it actually helping you rein in that chatter? Someone asked me earlier today, how do you know if you're experiencing chatter? And my response is, usually you know it when it's happening. You're having trouble focusing. You're finding yourself getting into problems in your relationships because you keep talking about your problems over and over. So this experience is usually one that I think is accessible to people. And likewise, when we experience relief, I think that's accessible too. So that would be my answer. It's like an exercise. You do an exercise in the gym. If you don't like it, don't do it again. But if it works, if it's getting those muscles, I don't have them to really display, but if it works, keep doing it. Okay, so I answered. So thank you all for the questions. Oh, maybe Julia, maybe you are going to do the final parting.
If we feel like we have said, we could go on for hours about this book and all that it entails. We here at Politics in Prose want to thank everyone, Ariana for moderating, Ethan Kross, Angela Duckworth, and Character Lab. We also want to thank our audience for their engaging and insightful questions. Those were really great. And of course, for their patronage. We wouldn't be able to have these amazing events and discussions without the book sales to support them. So go ahead and hop over to the link in the chat to purchase your copy of Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It, or visit politics-prose.com. And while you're there, make sure you check out our events calendar for the latest and greatest from Politics in Prose. From our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is